There is a fundamental, unspoken truth about the rugged, unyielding geography of highly isolated places, and it is a truth that goes far beyond the mere physical presence of the rocks and the trees and the freezing rivers. It is the fact that the landscape does not merely surround the resilient people who inhabit it, but rather, it seeps deeply into their very bones, and it dictates the rhythmic cadence of their breath, and it fundamentally shapes the stark, uncompromising architecture of their weary souls. In the sprawling, wind-scoured expanse of the Oakhaven Valley, a place where the towering, ancient mountains stand like silent, stoic sentinels against the relentlessly marching years, the people have long since learned to mimic the granite and the frost, valuing quiet, grueling endurance high above all performative displays of fleeting emotion or shallow vulnerability. It is a hard-working, calloused town where words are considered a strictly finite currency, hoarded carefully in the chest and spent only when absolutely, practically necessary, and where the collective, unshakable mindset assumes that a person's ultimate worth is measured not by what they profess to feel in the warmth of a tavern, but by the undeniable, physical proof of what they can build with their bare hands and what they can survive in the dead of winter. Within this tight-knit community of deeply flawed assumptions and rigidly held expectations lived Elias Thorne, a man whose very existence seemed painstakingly carved from the unyielding bedrock of the valley itself, grounded, hyper-competent, fiercely independent, and yet perpetually, tragically overlooked by those who could not see past the dirt on his boots. He was a man composed entirely of practical actions and silent labor, a man who possessed the rare, quiet, almost magical genius of being able to fix any broken, shattered thing with his scarred, heavily calloused hands, save for the profound and jagged, bleeding fractures buried deep within the dark recesses of his own complicated history. The town of Oakhaven, operating entirely within its collective, well-meaning, but deeply ignorant consensus, viewed Elias simply as a perpetual, necessary fixture of the harsh landscape, a solitary, broad-shouldered figure moving silently through the early morning fog, carrying an invisible, suffocating weight that no one could explicitly name but everyone could implicitly, uncomfortably feel. They whispered among themselves, leaning heavily on the dry, understated humor of the rustic working class, that Elias had been born with a rusty hammer clutched in his right hand and a heavy iron padlock permanently sealed over his chest, forever deadpan and stubbornly, entirely devoid of any self-awareness regarding the terrifying depth of his own profound isolation. But the authoritative narrator of this sweeping tale, possessing a godlike, omniscient view of both the macrocosm of the town's idle, fleeting gossip and the agonizing microcosm of intimate, fiercely guarded, unspoken yearning, knows with absolute certainty that the heavy baggage Elias carried was not a mere quirk of a grumpy character, but a suffocating, leaden cloak intricately woven from the threads of past familial failures, deeply betrayed trusts, and the exhausting, relentless, never-ending labor of keeping his own fractured heart safely barricaded against the unpredictable, violent storms of genuine human connection. He moved through his grueling days with a deliberate, rhythmic, and painfully unhurried pacing, matching the slow, natural, unstoppable passage of time, entirely convinced that if he simply kept his head down, and he kept his hands busy with the soil and the wood, and he kept his emotional expectations grounded firmly in the frozen dirt, he might eventually, slowly outwork the quiet, desperate, ringing ache of his own profound loneliness. Yet, the sweeping, unavoidable, philosophical reality of the human condition is that no man is truly an impenetrable island, and even the most fiercely capable and guarded individual inevitably accidentally leaves a footprint in the dust, a subtle, barely perceptible trail of desperate vulnerability that can only be accurately tracked by someone who possesses the boundless patience to look, and the quiet wisdom to understand, and the steadfast, unshakable courage to finally step onto the dangerous path. It was exactly this rare, observant, and fiercely grounded steadfastness that defined the quiet, unassuming existence of Clara Vance, a woman whose unpretentious, practical demeanor masterfully concealed a highly hypercompetent mind and a fiercely perceptive, unbroken spirit that saw straight through the collective, lazy illusions of the Oakhaven community. Clara managed the sprawling, ancient timber and supply yard situated on the muddy edge of the town, a dusty, chaotic, yet perfectly organized kingdom of raw pine wood, rusted iron nails, and thick coiled rope, and she ruled this domain with a quiet, unyielding, absolute authority that demanded no polite applause and expected no grand, public accolades from the men who bought her wares. She was not a woman given to utilizing flowery, poetic language or engaging in dramatic, sweeping physical gestures. Rather, she was a creature of intense, deliberate observation, a silent, deeply intelligent guardian of the town's practical, everyday needs, and the absolute, perfect counterpart to Elias's rigidly isolated, defensive existence. The community, leaning once more on their dry, deadpan, understated humor, often joked in the local diner that Clara Vance could accurately calculate the exact board footage required to completely rebuild a collapsed barn just by casually glancing at a pile of smoldering ash, and yet these exact same people remained completely, tragically blind to the agonizingly tender, deeply vulnerable way her sharp eyes relentlessly tracked Elias Thorne whenever his battered, sputtering truck slowly rolled into the muddy driveway of her lumber yard. She was a woman incredibly slow to act, preferring the absolute safety and the strategic advantage of the quiet shadows, but possessing an unshakable, terrifying resolve once a decision finally, firmly took root in the fertile soil of her brilliant mind. Clara understood the intricate, extended, sprawling metaphor of the harsh valley far better than anyone else alive. She intimately knew that just as the ancient, rushing river carved its deep path through the unyielding granite mountains not through a sudden, violent burst of force, but through the relentless, quiet, unstoppable friction of time, so too must a fiercely closed-off, heavily guarded heart be approached with endless, sprawling patience and the soft, persistent, unwavering pressure of a simple, undeniable presence. She watched Elias not with the shallow, fleeting pity that the rest of the town occasionally, lazily threw his way when he wasn't looking, but with a profound, unspoken, earth-shattering devotion, recognizing in the rigid line of his tense shoulders and the permanent downturned gaze of his tired eyes the exact same brand of heavy, protective armor she herself had worn for so many lonely, quiet years. While the town of Oakhaven saw only a broken, solitary, stubborn workhorse slowly grinding himself into dust, Clara saw a profoundly good man who simply cared far too deeply about the world, a man who had been shattered by the sheer, crushing weight of his own profound responsibilities, and who now carried that massive baggage with a tragic, misplaced, incredibly stubborn sense of silent nobility. The omniscient narrator sees the beautiful, painful, agonizing irony of it all, zooming out to witness these two incredible, fiercely capable souls moving through the exact same physical space, breathing the exact same freezing mountain air, separated by only a few incredibly short feet of sawdust and stacked timber, yet standing completely paralyzed on opposite sides of a vast, invisible, terrifying canyon of unexpressed, desperate yearning. Clara's quiet, hyper-competent nature extended far beyond the simple, mundane inventory of her busy lumberyard. It reached directly into the very complex emotional architecture of Elias's heavily guarded life, as she meticulously, silently cataloged his shifting moods, his rigid habits, and the subtle, nearly imperceptible shifts in his stiff posture that indicated whether the invisible burden he carried that particular day was manageable, or if it was actively, violently threatening to drag him completely under the surface of the freezing earth. The rhythm of their daily interactions slowly, inevitably became a long, agonizing, slow-burn dance, meticulously choreographed over the spanning of endless months and grueling years by the simple, practical, undeniable necessity of rustic commerce and basic survival in a rugged, unforgiving land. Elias would arrive at the heavy gates of the supply yard just as the pale morning sun crested the jagged, snow-capped peaks, casting long, dramatic, sweeping shadows across the frosted, rock-strewn dirt, and Clara would always, inevitably be waiting for him, her calloused hands resting calmly on the scarred, polished wooden counter, serving as an unspoken, completely reliable anchor in his tempestuous, violently spinning world. Their brief dialogue during these early morning encounters was notoriously sparse, heavily, densely layered with the kind of intense, unspoken subtext that requires absolutely no verbal translation for those who truly, deeply know how to listen to the silence. Elias would step heavily into the dim, richly wood-scented interior of the quiet shop, his boots thudding against the floorboards, and he would lay a crumpled, dirty slip of paper on the counter, and Clara would calmly read it without a word, and she would move silently through the towering aisles, gathering the iron nails and the steel brackets and the heavy, oiled chains, and the thick silence between. Them would slowly swell and stretch, agonizingly pregnant with every single desperate, beautiful thing they stubbornly refused to say out loud. Cold out. Elias would suddenly murmur, breaking the quiet with his voice like a low, rough rasp of sandpaper on oak, his tired eyes deliberately, fiercely fixed on the rusted, dented coffee tin sitting near the heavy brass register. Freezing, Clara would immediately reply, perfectly mirroring his exact tone and his absolute brevity, gently, carefully sliding the heavy brown paper bag across the smooth wood, her long fingers stopping mere millimeters from the rough, scarred skin of his large hand. This mirrored dialogue, a constant, deeply reassuring echoing of simple, factual statements back and forth across the counter, became their very own private, beautiful language. A safe, unpretentious, incredibly grounded framework where they could quietly, secretly verify their mutual understanding and their deep emotional alignment without ever once risking the terrifying, world-ending exposure of a direct, vulnerable confession. The slow, relentless passage of time acted as a silent, cruel antagonist, slowly, methodically grinding their fleeting youths into the valley dust, turning the broad oak leaves from bright green to brittle gold and back again in a sweeping, cyclical rhythm, while their protracted, unspoken feelings boiled and simmered just beneath the fragile crust of their daily, exhausting routines. They both inherently, deeply valued quiet, tangible action far above any kind of performative, shallow display, and so their immense, growing affection for one another was strictly translated into the microscopic, easily deniable details of their mundane transactions. Clara always, meticulously ensuring the very best, straightest pieces of cured lumber were subtly, secretly set aside for Elias's sprawling accounts, and Elias meticulously, unnecessarily sweeping the muddy loading dock with an old broom before he ever climbed into his truck to leave, a completely superfluous chore that served absolutely no practical purpose other than acting as a physical, undeniable manifestation of his lingering, desperate reluctance to finally walk away from her presence. The town gossips, sitting on their porches with their deadpan, completely unaware acknowledgement of mere stubbornness, occasionally noted with a dry chuckle how remarkably, absurdly long it took the busy Elias Thorne to buy a single, simple box of roofing tacks, completely, tragically oblivious to the profound fact that within those quiet, stretched-out, highly strategic pauses, two fiercely capable, immensely lonely people were silently, desperately screaming out for genuine connection, completely, utterly paralyzed by the shared, unspoken terror that taking a single, brave step forward might permanently shatter the fragile, beautiful, agonizing equilibrium they had so desperately, carefully constructed over the passing years. As the long seasons turned, the omnipresent, violently shifting weather of the isolated valley became a sprawling, extended, deeply accurate metaphor for the suffocating, chaotic internal state Elias continuously, silently endured, a literal and figurative, raging storm that constantly threatened to finally bury him completely under the sheer, crushing volume of his own unresolved, tragic history. The bitter winter that particular year descended upon the unsuspecting town of Oakhaven with a vicious, unyielding, almost personal cruelty, freezing the soft earth into impenetrable iron and burying the winding mountain roads beneath towering, impassable drifts of blinding, sparkling white snow. Elias immediately, instinctively retreated much further into the isolated, silent fortress of his high mountain farm, his total physical isolation perfectly mimicking the deep hibernation of the wild, hunted things of the forest, save for the tragic fact that his isolation was not a restful, healing sleep, but a hyper-vigilant, completely exhausting, unending guard duty against the relentless ghost of his deeply buried past. The invisible, authoritative narrator, zooming seamlessly from the macrocosm of the violently blizzard-battered town to the microscopic, intimately painful theater of Elias's racing mind, witnesses the heavy, crushing, unbearable weight of his long-held baggage, the dark memories of a family violently fractured, an immense debt left agonizingly unpaid, a catastrophic, personal failure that had long since been forgotten and forgiven by absolutely everyone in the wide world except for the stubbornly guilty man staring back at him in the frosted bathroom mirror. This emotional baggage was not merely a thought. It was a severe, physical pressure locked tight in his chest, a dark, churning, freezing river of toxic guilt that he firmly, absolutely believed would instantly, violently drown anyone foolish or brave enough to casually wade into his treacherous waters. Yet, the fiercely grounded Clara Vance was not a woman who inherently feared the biting cold, nor was she easily intimidated by the dark, churning, unpredictable rivers of the human soul. She understood, with the deep, innate, practical wisdom of someone who has spent an entire lifetime meticulously studying the complex grain of tough, resilient wood, that the absolute only way to prevent a beautiful, ancient tree from violently snapping under the immense, crushing weight of a winter ice storm is to physically, bravely step outside and knock the heavy ice from its bending branches, braving the freezing, blinding rain to provide immediate, tangible relief. And so, when Elias shockingly, terrifyingly failed to make his scheduled, rhythmic, deeply ingrained weekly trip to the lumberyard for 3 consecutive, agonizingly long weeks, Clara did not lazily succumb to the town's collective, flawed assumption that the old, stubborn hermit simply, predictably wished to be left entirely alone to rot in his own stubborn pride. She fiercely, immediately recognized the deadly, critical difference between a man peacefully seeking quiet solitude and a man actively, silently suffocating under a massive, crushing avalanche of his own terrified making. She methodically, quietly loaded the heavy bed of her 4-wheel drive truck with dry split firewood, thick salted provisions, and the quiet, fierce, unshakable determination that ultimately defined her very core essence, setting out completely alone into the howling teeth of the blinding blizzard, serving as a singular, steadfast, incredibly brave beacon of warmth, cutting slowly through the freezing, blinding white landscape, driving deliberately and highly purposefully toward the strictly closed door of the fiercely guarded man she had loved in absolute, unwavering silence for the better part of a grueling decade. It was exactly during the great, howling, terrifying peak of this unprecedented winter storm that the agonizingly deliberate, unhurried pacing of their protracted story suddenly, violently shifted, forced entirely into rapid motion by the sheer, undeniable, practical necessity of immediate survival against the incredibly antagonistic, crushing forces of unforgiving nature. Clara finally arrived at Elias's remote, snow-buried farm only to find the massive, heavy timber roof of his western cattle barn violently, catastrophically caved in under the sheer, immense weight of the accumulated snow, and she found Elias himself, half frozen, covered in mud, and moving with the slow, desperate, terrifying exhaustion of a fiercely proud man who has finally, irrevocably reached the absolute, breaking limit of his hyper-competent, solitary endurance. There were absolutely no grand, dramatic, theatrical exclamations of shock from Clara, nor were there any flowery, poetic declarations of heroic rescue. remaining entirely true to their deeply unpretentious, strictly grounded nature. Clara simply, calmly stepped out of the warm cab of her idling truck, pulled her thick woolen work gloves tighter around her freezing wrists, grabbed a heavy, rusted iron snow shovel from the truck bed, and walked purposefully, wordlessly, directly to his side in the howling mud. The main oak joist snapped. Elias yelled loudly over the screaming, chaotic wind, his deep voice completely stripped of all its usual, carefully guarded, protective nuance, abruptly reduced to the blunt, brutal, unadorned honesty of an immediate, life-or-death crisis. I can see that it snapped. Clara immediately yelled back, perfectly mirroring his intense, practical focus, completely and utterly ignoring the monumental fact that she was currently trespassing on the highly sacred, strictly isolated ground he had fiercely forbidden absolutely anyone to ever walk upon. And without another single, wasted word, they instantly fell into a synchronized, highly rhythmic, grueling labor, a continuous, deliberate, breathless insertion of quiet, cooperative action that spoke volumes louder and clearer than any spoken poetry ever could. They fiercely dug, and they heavily hauled, and they desperately braced the shattered, splintered wooden beams, and the freezing, driving rain violently lashed at their numb faces, and the sheer, unavoidable physical proximity of the tight space forcefully pushed them into an inescapable, highly intimate, unbroken alignment of heaving breath and straining muscle and deeply shared, unyielding willpower. The dry, deeply understated, situational humor of the terrifying ordeal was absolutely not lost on the watchful, omniscient narrator. Here were two incredibly stubborn people who had literally spent countless years carefully, meticulously avoiding accidentally, brushing their bare hands together over a simple retail counter, now literally, forcefully pressing their freezing shoulders firmly together to collectively hoist a massive, frozen oak beam perfectly into place, their very lives and the lives of the trapped animals depending, entirely and absolutely on the raw strength and the absolute, unquestionable trustworthiness of the other. For agonizing, unbroken hours, the absolutely only sounds cutting through the dark valley were the howling, violent wind, the heavy crunch of moving snow, and the synchronized, deeply exhausted, rhythmic grunts of two intensely capable, undeniably stubborn individuals absolutely refusing to yield the ground to the storm or to the creeping despair. In that freezing, incredibly muddy, entirely chaotic, dangerous mess, Clara Vance was finally, unequivocally, physically showing up, loudly manifesting her deep, entirely unspoken devotion through the incredibly grueling, utterly unglamorous, back-breaking labor of literally lifting a completely broken, incredibly heavy roof off the freezing back of a completely broken, incredibly weary man, proving, once and for all, that she was absolutely not just a passive observer of his tragic life, but a fiercely capable, entirely equal participant perfectly designed to weather his absolute darkest, most terrifying storms. The immediate aftermath of the violent storm brought a profound, ringing, incredibly heavy silence to the high mountain farm, an incredibly sharp, jarring contrast to the terrifying, chaotic violence of the long night, as the pale morning sun finally, slowly broke over the eastern granite ridge, illuminating a sprawling landscape entirely, beautifully transformed and highlighting a massive, invisible barrier between two exhausted souls completely, utterly, finally demolished. Elias and Clara sat heavily, slumped together on the thick, heavy wooden bench of his front porch, their heavy winter clothes stiff and cracking with frozen, brown mud, their blistered hands trembling violently with the fading rush of exhausted adrenaline, holding thick, steaming ceramic mugs of pitch-black coffee tightly cradled between their numb, battered palms. The town's distant, lazy gossip, the rigid, suffocating community expectations, and the many long, agonizing years of prolonged, carefully maintained tension had all completely, suddenly faded into the pristine, blindingly white background of the snow, leaving entirely behind only the raw, unvarnished, undeniable truth of their mutual, cooperative survival. The incredibly sparse dialogue that finally followed was direct, heavy, and overwhelmingly loaded with the immense, crushing weight of absolutely everything that had slowly led them to sit on this exact, freezing bench. Elias stared blankly out at the partially ruined, heavily braced barn, the muscles in his tight jaw working nervously. "You really shouldn't have come all the way up here in that terrible weather," he stated flatly, his rough voice a low, vibrating rumble of residual, deeply ingrained panic, desperately trying to mask his profound, terrifying realization of exactly how much he had desperately, absolutely needed her to be there. Clara did not look away from the bright, glaring horizon. "You couldn't have possibly lifted that heavy beam entirely alone," she replied calmly, her chosen words flat, entirely factual, and completely, remarkably unbothered by his sudden, instinctive, highly defensive posture. "I would have easily managed it somehow," he immediately echoed back, offering an incredibly weak, entirely habitual, transparent lie born of pure habit. "No," Clara corrected incredibly softly, finally turning her head slowly to meet his panicked, exhausted gaze. "You absolutely wouldn't have." The habitual mirroring in their speech suddenly morphed from a useful tool of emotional avoidance into a sharp, gleaming blade of blunt, absolute honesty, effortlessly slicing cleanly through the thick, polite, incredibly lonely fiction they had both diligently maintained for so many long years. Elias looked deeply into her dark, steady eyes, and he saw absolutely no pity, no harsh judgment, and no naive, foolish illusions about the intense messiness of his broken existence. He saw only a steadfast, incredibly solid, undeniable reflection of his own utterly exhausted, yearning soul, a fiercely competent woman who had willingly, bravely stepped into the freezing, dangerous darkness simply and only because he was standing there. The massive realization settled over the invisible audience of the omniscient narrator like a heavy, deeply worn, incredibly comforting woolen blanket. They were absolutely no longer simply a broken man carrying heavy baggage and a quiet woman watching him sadly from afar. They were immediately, undeniably two distinct, perfectly interlocking halves of a highly formidable, entirely equal partnership, forged not in the soft, romantic, fleeting glow of candlelight, but in the brutal, freezing, terrifying crucible of deeply shared labor and immense, unspoken trust. Yet, even as the deep, undeniable warmth of this profound realization slowly began to thaw the incredibly icy, heavily guarded edges of Elias's battered heart, the deeply ingrained, completely irrational terror of his tragic past violently rose up again, whispering viciously in his ear that he was a permanent curse, an unbearable burden, and that allowing this radiant, hyper-competent, incredible woman to permanently attach herself to his slowly sinking ship would ultimately be the absolute ultimate act of complete, unforgivable selfishness. But a deeply wounded heart, heavily accustomed to the freezing cold, often tragically interprets the sudden, blinding, life-saving heat of a roaring fire, not as a necessary rescue, but as an immediate, agonizing, terrifying physical threat, and Elias Thorne's deeply instinctive, heavily traumatized reaction to the profound, overwhelming emotional alignment he suddenly felt with Clara was to frantically, desperately, immediately begin to rebuild the massive stone walls that the winter storm had so effortlessly, beautifully torn down. In the incredibly long, tense weeks that immediately followed the great blizzard, a dense, suffocating, entirely unnatural silence descended once more upon the valley. But this time, it was absolutely not the comfortable, rhythmic, easily predictable silence of their past daily routines. It was a highly tense, incredibly jagged, an entirely cowardly silence born entirely of Elias's massive, internal, suffocating panic. He completely, abruptly stopped coming to the lumber supply yard altogether, cowardly sending a young, hired farmhand down the winding mountain road to briefly collect his absolute bare necessities, utilizing the vast, empty, physical space of the sprawling valley as a massive, tangible shield against the completely terrifying, profound vulnerability of being truly, completely, unarguably seen by another human being. The deeply philosophical narrator actively observes this frantic, sad retreat as a tragic, sweeping, extended metaphor of the massive ocean tide violently, desperately pulling back from the safety of the shore, completely exposing the sharp, ugly, dangerous rocks of his deep insecurity and his deeply ingrained, completely false belief that his personal baggage was inherently toxic, highly infectious, and entirely, utterly unworthy of Clara's steadfast, beautiful, unshakable devotion. The town of Oakhaven, lazily relying once again on their collective, deeply flawed, incredibly shallow assumptions, merely shrugged their heavy shoulders and noted with dry humor that the old, crazy mountain hermit had finally, completely snapped his thin tether, entirely content to let him vanish completely back into his rustic, isolated, lonely myth without lifting a single finger to help. But the fiercely grounded Clara Vance was entirely, wonderfully immune to the town's collective blindness, and she personally possessed a godlike, boundless patience that absolutely refused to be lightly insulted or easily deterred by the pathetic, flailing, desperate attempts of a drowning man actively trying to violently swat away a sturdy life preserver. She deeply felt the agonizing, incredibly slow stretch of the passing days. She meticulously cataloged the deliberate, entirely cowardly avoidance, and she understood with absolute, crystalline, undeniable clarity that Elias was absolutely not rejecting her out of malice or lack of affection. He was desperately, aggressively, entirely mistakenly trying to protect her from the perceived danger of himself. The dry, highly understated humor of his sheer, unbelievable lack of basic self-awareness brought a tight, incredibly sad, knowing smile to her weary face. He honestly, truly believed he could permanently scare her off by simply hiding in his barn, completely, entirely oblivious to the profound fact that her deep love for him was as unyielding, as incredibly heavy, and as deeply rooted in the bedrock as the massive, ancient oak trees that proudly gave the valley its enduring name. And so, with the highly deliberate, painfully unhurried, incredibly rhythmic pacing of a determined woman slowly stepping up to a sacred altar, Clara made the final, unshakable, monumental decision to permanently strip away the lingering, polite subtext, to entirely shatter the agonizing, drawn-out, slow burn, and to directly confront the heavy phantom weight of his tragic past with the overwhelming, deeply tangible, absolute reality of her unwavering present. The final confrontation absolutely did not happen in the bright, public, gossipy light of the town square, nor did it feature any soaring, cinematic, highly performative dramatic speeches. It quietly, intensely unfolded in the dim, densely dust-moted, deeply private sanctuary of Elias's own heavy woodworking shop, deeply grounded in the rustic, unpretentious elegance of scattered, rusted iron tools and the heavy, sharp, metallic scent of cold steel and freshly cut pine. Clara simply, quietly arrived, completely unannounced and utterly, fiercely unpretentious, pushing open the incredibly heavy, creaking wooden double doors and boldly letting the late, golden afternoon light forcefully spill across the sawdust-covered floorboards, effectively, completely trapping Elias in the very center of the small room like a deeply terrified, entirely cornered wild animal. He instantly froze, his massive, calloused hands gripping a heavy iron wrench so incredibly tightly his large knuckles turned stark white, his wide eyes darting frantically toward the deep shadows, desperately, instinctively searching for a quick escape route that simply did not exist in the small space. The deliberate pacing of the narrative abruptly ground to an absolute, terrifying halt. The massive, highly strategic pause stretching out to an almost unbearable, ringing length, forcefully letting the sheer, immense emotional weight of the entire decade press down heavily upon their incredibly tense, unmoving shoulders. "You sent the young boy down to the yard for the heavy fencing wire," Clara stated calmly, her steady voice completely devoid of any harsh, accusatory tone, presenting a simple, blunt, entirely factual observation of his completely transparent cowardice. "I was incredibly busy up here. Elias muttered quickly, his voice gravelly, shaking, his terrified gaze fixed firmly on the scarred wooden worktable, the comfortable, safe mirrored dialogue completely, violently broken as he desperately, pathetically tried to maintain his rapidly crumbling, invisible barricade. Clara took an incredibly slow, highly deliberate step forward, physically closing the tense distance, her immense, unyielding presence loudly, silently demanding that he finally, permanently stop running away from his own life. "Elias," she said softly, permanently stripping away every single ounce of flowery, protective language, her clear voice ringing with blunt, fierce, undeniable honesty. "Look directly at me." He tightly squeezed his tired eyes shut, the thick muscles in his tight jaw trembling violently, the suffocating, heavy cloak of his deep past failures rapidly rising up to violently choke him. "You absolutely don't understand, Clara," he whispered hoarsely, his deep voice painfully cracking under the immense, crushing strain of his self-imposed 10 years isolation, his rigid posture finally, completely crumbling beneath the sheer weight of a long decade of intense loneliness. "I simply can't do this. I am absolutely not the good man you think I am." He slowly, painfully forced himself to look at her, his dark eyes shining brightly with heavy, long unshed tears, and he finally delivered the absolute ultimate, heartbreaking, entirely desperate defense of his incredibly solitary, deeply lonely life. "I told her, I come with entirely too much heavy baggage." The tragic words hung thickly in the dusty air, incredibly heavy, painfully definitive, serving as an unadorned, completely stripped-down confession of his perceived absolute, unforgivable unworthiness. Clara absolutely did not flinch. She absolutely did not take a single step back, and she absolutely did not offer any trite, empty, highly performative, meaningless reassurances. Instead, she boldly closed the final few inches between them, bravely reached out her steady, incredibly strong, heavily calloused hands, and gently, but incredibly firmly wrapped them entirely around his trembling, tightly clenched fists. And she whispered, staring directly into his fractured soul, "Then let me slowly help you carry it." The intense, agonizing fever finally, permanently broke, not with a loud, dramatic shout, but with a deeply shuddering, incredibly breathless, sweeping exhale that seemed to violently empty Elias's tight lungs of 10 incredibly long years' worth of completely stale, highly poisoned, lonely air, the absolute, fierce, incredibly beautiful honesty of her direct statement completely, permanently annihilating the invisible, massive stone fortress he had spent an entire lifetime meticulously constructing, the immense, exhausting tension of quiet, desperate yearning, which had entirely defined absolutely every single mundane interaction they had ever carefully shared, instantly, entirely evaporated into the dust, rapidly replaced by a incredibly deep, entirely overwhelming, radiating warmth, a profound, soul-deep relief that completely washed over him like a sudden, deeply soaking, incredibly gentle summer rain. The wise, omniscient narrator closely watches as the heavy, highly suffocating baggage of Elias's deep past, the immense guilt and the tragic failures and the relentless, grinding, daily isolation, absolutely did not magically, instantly vanish into the ether as if it never existed. Rather, the fundamental, core nature of the heavy burden was instantly, fundamentally, beautifully transformed the exact moment another pair of incredibly capable, deeply loving hands reached out to equally share the immense load. He weakly dropped the heavy iron wrench, the loud metallic clatter echoing sharply in the incredibly quiet workshop, and for the absolute first time in a completely agonizing decade, Elias Thorne heavily leaned forward and completely buried his tired face deep in the crook of Clara's soft neck, his incredibly large, highly capable frame trembling violently, uncontrollably, as he finally, completely, surrendered to the undeniable, beautiful reality of being completely, entirely seen, fully and intimately known, and entirely, unreservedly accepted exactly as he was. Clara's strong arms wrapped tightly around his broad, shaking shoulders, serving as a steadfast, incredibly unshakable, deeply grounded anchor holding him safely and firmly in the bright present, her calloused hands gently smoothing the rough, highly dusty fabric of his heavy coat in a continuous, incredibly rhythmic, profoundly soothing motion of pure, completely unadorned comfort. The monumental transition from agonizing, deep isolation to deeply rooted, incredibly strong partnership was remarkably immediate and profoundly visceral, entirely grounded not in any kind of fleeting, shallow romantic passion, but firmly in the overwhelming, incredibly uplifting, immense gratitude of two fiercely competent, deeply tired survivors who had finally, beautifully realized they absolutely no longer had to survive entirely on their own. There were absolutely no more words spoken in that dim, incredibly peaceful workshop, for the highly sparse, direct, incredibly heavy subtext of their connection had finally, permanently achieved its absolute ultimate, beautiful purpose. They stood quietly together in the slowly fading golden light, deeply breathing in the sharp scent of cut sawdust and impending dusk, the incredibly practical, entirely everyday reality of their mundane existence immediately elevated into an epic, sprawling, sweeping working-class romance. The complete shift in their profound dynamic was absolutely not marked by a sudden, drastic, entirely unrealistic change in their core personalities, but rather by a completely quiet, incredibly deep, highly shared peace, the absolute, profound satisfaction of a heavily earned, incredibly enduring love, as they finally, slowly stepped apart, gently wiped the dusty grime from their incredibly tired faces, and calmly walked side by side out of the dark shadows, completely ready to face the mundane, highly beautiful, completely ordinary labor of an ordinary life, entirely together. Time, in its incredibly infinite, deeply sweeping mercy, eventually, completely ceased to be a silent, incredibly cruel antagonist in the sprawling, beautiful story of Elias and Clara, permanently transforming instead into a highly benevolent, incredibly watchful, entirely silent witness to the slow, incredibly beautiful compounding of their deeply shared, completely ordinary days. The many long years that quietly followed their profoundly quiet, completely unpretentious revelation rolled slowly over the sprawling Oakhaven Valley with a highly rhythmic, deeply sweeping, incredibly grounded grace, the changing seasons entirely altering the sharp color of the massive mountains and adding brilliant silver to their graying temples, but completely, utterly failing to erode a single ounce of the massive, unyielding bedrock of their profound, entirely unshakable connection. The incredibly stubborn town gossips, forcefully, entirely forced to completely abandon their deeply flawed, incredibly shallow assumptions and their dry, entirely understated jokes about the crazy old mountain hermit, watched closely with a incredibly quiet, completely undeniable, entirely deep reverence as Elias Thorne slowly, beautifully morphed from a tragic, incredibly lonely fixture of the harsh landscape into a profoundly grounded, fiercely alive, completely central pillar of the entire community, firmly anchored entirely by the incredibly steadfast, constantly observant presence of Clara permanently at his side. They both still diligently managed the sprawling, dusty supply yard, and they still fiercely rebuilt the completely shattered wooden fences, and they still absolutely, incredibly valued quiet, highly practical action far above any kind of performative, shallow emotional display, and the incredibly lyrical, deeply rhythmic, totally unhurried cadence of their daily lives became a massive, continuous, deeply physical testament to the absolute, undeniable, world-shaking power of merely incredibly quietly showing up for each other, day after grueling, entirely beautiful day. The completely invisible narrator, slowly pulling far back to a deeply sweeping, highly omniscient, incredibly philosophical view of the entire sprawling valley, directly addresses the completely silent, watching audience with this final, profoundly unadorned, completely unshakable truth. The absolute greatest, most incredibly enduring romances are almost rarely, if ever, born from completely spotless, entirely unburdened souls accidentally meeting in absolutely perfect, totally pristine conditions. Rather, they are fiercely, permanently forged deep in the freezing mud and the blinding snow and the highly quiet, incredibly desperate, completely beautiful exhaustion of ordinary, mundane existence, entirely built by two deeply, completely flawed, incredibly heavy-laden individuals who bravely look at the absolutely terrifying, massive mountain of each other's deep trauma and simply, quietly pick up a heavy iron shovel. Their incredibly profound, absolutely enduring love was a massive, sweeping, extended metaphor of the sprawling valley itself, entirely rugged, incredibly unpretentious, completely, totally immune to the violently fleeting winter storms, and deeply, entirely, permanently rooted in the incredibly rocky, highly unyielding soil. Elias absolutely never entirely, magically lost the highly subtle, deeply invisible, tragic limp of his massive past baggage, and Clara absolutely never entirely lost her fiercely hypervigilant, incredibly observant, deeply protective edge, but they beautifully, permanently carried the immense, crushing weight together, their rough hands heavily calloused, their brave hearts fiercely, completely, protected by each other's absolutely unwavering, incredibly deep devotion, a completely quiet, truly epic, profoundly grounded triumph of absolute human connection, standing incredibly tall and completely unshatterable against the vast, sweeping, absolutely beautiful backdrop of eternity.